How to prevent diabetes. In this video, you will learn not only how to prevent diabetes, but also how to prevent the earlier versions called prediabetes and insulin resistance. Diabetes is the greatest medical threat the world has ever seen, but it is preventable and even reversible. More than 1/3 the population today has insulin resistance, also known as prediabetes, and 7 out of 8 people are heading in that direction. But as big a problem as diabetes is, an even bigger problem is that as far as prevention is concerned, they're measuring the wrong thing, and the standard treatment for diabetes and prediabetes and insulin resistance at best can solve one problem, but in the process they create another problem that can be just as severe. This may be the greatest health issue that we are facing today because it is so widespread and so misunderstood. But before we're done today, you will understand the mechanisms involved and you will know how to prevent and even reverse diabetes. Coming right up. I'm Dr. Ekberg. I'm a holistic doctor and a former Olympian in decathlon. And if you'd like to truly master health by understanding how the body really works, make sure that you subscribe and hit that notification bell so that you don't miss anything. So it is well known that these are huge problems today. And I got these numbers from some publications from the American Diabetes Association that today in the United States we have 30 million diabetics, and on top of that there's 8 million who are undiagnosed. We have 86 million pre-diabetics, and pre-diabetic means that if you don't change something, you're most likely going to have diabetes in about 5 years or so. And 90% of those people do not know that they have it. If we want to go a little further, then we can also say that even if you're not officially in the criteria for prediabetes, anyone who is overweight is probably most likely having some degree of insulin resistance and is heading in that direction. And 87% of the population in the US would account to about 250 million people. So that's the scope of this problem, that the 30 million that are diagnosed, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And even so, those 30 million account for 1 out of 5 healthcare dollars. The diabetes healthcare is 20% of the total healthcare, diabetes-related costs. And when we take the older population in Medicare, it's 1 out of 3 Medicare dollars. So we're all paying for this indirectly through lost production, through suffering, through increased health insurance costs, and through taxes on the Medicare. So it's not just the human suffering, but if these 30 million grow into several hundred million, then it's going to be a huge financial problem as well. Today, each day, we will get 4,660 new diagnosed cases of diabetes. We will have 295 amputations today, and we will have 137 new cases of kidney failure that will be end stage and require dialysis for the rest of their life. But then some people say that, well, you keep telling us to eat less carbs, but in Asia they eat lots of carbs. Their whole diets are based on rice, and they don't have any diabetes. Well, that's a myth. Think again. That was true while food was scarce, but today when food is less scarce, the 2 countries that are growing the fastest are India and China, which are traditionally very dependent on rice and carbohydrates. So today there's almost 3 times as many diabetics in India as there are in the US, and in China there's almost 4 times as many diabetics. There are 415 million diabetics in the world today, and in China they're getting close to 50% pre-diabetes. So this is not a limited problem, it's not a cultural, it's the fact that we eat too many carbohydrates, and because food is no longer scarce, then those carbohydrates are creating insulin resistance and diabetes. We can eat a certain amount or a fairly large amount of carbohydrates as long as food is scarce, because if there's enough time to the next meal, then we're going to store some food and we're going to burn off the food before the next meal. But when food is no longer scarce, carbohydrate is not a food that we can tolerate. Some of you have seen this, but for those who are new, we'll just do a quick review that the mechanism of developing diabetes and insulin resistance is sugar. And when we say sugar, we mean all forms of carbohydrate, because grain and rice and potato, they are starches, and starch is only 10 minutes away from becoming sugar. It has very, very high impact on blood sugar and therefore very high impact on insulin. So sugar in all its forms drive insulin. When insulin goes up, and it goes up frequently and it goes up to high levels frequently, then that insulin is going to store excess fuel into the cell. When the cell can't handle anymore, the cell becomes insulin resistant because it says, I can't handle any more fuel. Diabetes is nothing but, and we're talking type 2 diabetes of course, is nothing but a late stage development of insulin resistance. It is an adaptation, and we've talked about that in some other videos. We'll give you a link and some references at the end. The authorities are very aware of this problem, of the scope of the problem, so they're creating more and more campaigns to inform the public of how big a problem this is. So I've got these numbers from a couple of those publications, and each time they say, join us to learn how to fight this costly disease. Come and learn how to combat this costly disease at diabetes.org/Congress, published by the American Diabetes Association. And that's all good and well that they're trying to inform, but what are they trying to do? What is the end goal? What is the treatment? Well, unfortunately, the treatment consists of eating more sugar and exercising, and they tell you to lose weight, and then they tell you to take medication that will make you gain weight. And everyone who has been on metformin or insulin for a while knows that it will make you gain weight. That's what insulin does. It's a storage hormone. And they confuse it because they tell you to lose the weight. They've seen skinny people have less diabetes, but they get it backwards. The fat is not causing the insulin resistance. The insulin resistance is causing the weight gain. So when you take medication that will drive the fuel into the cell, you're increasing insulin resistance, you're increasing weight, and you're making it impossible to reverse this process. As a result, I've had many people come through my office and say that, oh yeah, I have diabetes, but it is okay. It is being managed. I'm seeing a doctor. He has it under control. And under control means that they're suppressing blood sugar, and in the process, this person can look forward to living 10 years shorter, have more complications, and spend $250,000 in the treatment of their disease if they get diagnosed by age 50 until the time they die. That, unfortunately, is what it means to manage the disease. So how can the problem be so misunderstood? And the main reason is that we think diabetes type 1 and type 2 are the same thing when they are total opposites. And we need to realize that even though there are 415 million people, and they're expecting that to double in a few decades, this disease or this adaptation, this condition, did not exist 150, 200 years ago. When they discovered diabetes, when they first started talking about diabetes, they talked about some mysterious thing where the blood sugar was incredibly high. And all of those cases were type 1. That was when some process had destroyed the pancreas and they had lost the ability to make insulin. And if you don't have insulin, you can't get the blood sugar out of the bloodstream. Anything you eat gets into the bloodstream, but it can't get out. And now the blood sugar goes sky high, and they get really high blood sugar. and they have no insulin. So in that case, in type 1 diabetes, insulin will save their life. It is absolutely necessary. But then they think that type 2 diabetes is the same thing. Type 1 is kind of a disease, if you want to call it that, because something is broken. Type 2 is not a disease. Nothing's broken. It's all working. We're just pushing the system into an impossible place. So type 2 diabetes also has very high blood sugar, but unlike type 1, type 2s have a lot of insulin. They have too much. So when we treat it with insulin, we make the problem worse. So these are two completely different things. One requires insulin, one should never have any more. And here's the problem with focusing on the blood sugar, thinking that the blood sugar is the problem. Blood glucose, blood sugar, is actively controlled. Your body goes through an incredible amount of effort to keep the blood sugar within a certain range. It really, really loves to have it between 80 to 120. Anything above that, it will pump out and it will store for future use. When blood sugar goes down, we can retrieve it, convert it into blood sugar and energy. So our entire fuel economy in the body, the physiology around energy, is around keeping the blood sugar within a certain level, storing the excess, retrieving it when it's too low, but keeping it in there. It's a managed variable. So when we measure it after it has been controlled. It only tells us if it's being controlled or if it has failed. It doesn't tell us where it's heading. So as an analogy, right now in Georgia, it is very, very warm. We're in July, and in the American South, it's been averaging about 95 degrees Fahrenheit every day. That's about 35 degrees Celsius for those of you who are abroad. And let's say that someone asked us, could you do a little study? Could you measure your temperature in Georgia? Because we want to figure out how much air conditioning, how much electricity we're going to need to keep it comfortable inside. Said, oh, okay, I'll be glad to. I'll measure the temperature. So then I measured the temperature and I get it back to them and I said, well, I measured 72 degrees. It was 22 degrees Celsius, 72 degrees Fahrenheit. And they said, that's impossible. Where did you measure? And I said, in my living room. That's where it's comfortable. That's where the temperature has been controlled. Okay? Do you see how ridiculous it is to measure a variable that has already been altered? That's what we're doing with glucose when we're measuring the glucose. We want to measure the factors that influence the glucose. We want to measure the insulin. We want to measure how hard does the body have to work at controlling that glucose. So here's how insulin resistance develops. We talked about the mechanism, sugar, insulin, the cell starts resisting, that's insulin resistance. But how do we measure that? Well, let's say in year 1 we measure glucose and we measure insulin, and they're well balanced. We have balance between, we're insulin sensitive. Then 5 years later we measure again and the glucose is the same because it's a controlled variable. The body has suppressed it. It's working to keep it there. But insulin went up to double. So the cells are becoming resistant because it takes twice as much insulin to manage the blood sugar. And then 5 years later, the glucose is still the same, but it takes 3 times more. So if we only measure glucose, we're not getting any useful information. It's like measuring the inside of the living room to figure out how hot it is outside. Okay, we're not getting relevant information. You can't measure the suppressed variable. You have to change, you have to measure the variable that is changing based on the demand and the effort. So next we want to understand something very, very important, that there are really 2 problems, and traditional diabetes care handles one and creates more of the other. So the two problems are, on the one hand, blood glucose, elevated blood glucose, and on the other hand, elevated insulin resistance, because these have different effects. They cause different problems. So if we let the blood glucose run rampant, then we're going to have what's called microvascular disease or microvessel disease. That means the tiny, tiny blood vessels in the body, they're going to swell and get inflamed, and they're going to have problems, which is going to cause blindness because we have lots of small blood vessels in the retina, in the eye. We're going to have kidney problems, kidney disease, because we have lots and lots of tiny blood vessels in the filtering apparatus of the kidney. And we're going to have neuropathy because there's lots of little blood vessels around the fine nerve endings in hands and fingers especially. It is super, super important to control the blood sugar, because otherwise we're going to get all of these things. But we have to understand that in controlling the blood sugar, if we control the blood sugar through medication, we are pushing the extra fuel into the cell who is already overloaded. It doesn't want it. So now we are increasing the insulin resistance, and in doing that, we are creating what's called metabolic syndrome. And metabolic syndrome is everything else that people die from, which is increased blood pressure, cholesterol, chronic inflammation, cardiovascular disease, stroke, and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease, neurodegenerative diseases, dementia. So we have two different packages of problems, and treating one will create the other. So you have a few different choices. You can keep eating like you're eating and not get the treatment, and now you're going to have the blindness, kidney problems, and neuropathy. Or you can keep eating like you're doing and take the treatment, suppress, control the blood sugar, and get metabolic syndrome, and you keep your fingers and toes, but you get stroke, cardiovascular disease, and Alzheimer's. Or there is another option, and that is you don't keep eating the way you have been. You don't follow the general guidelines of eating 300 grams of carbohydrate in times of food abundance, but you change something. In order to prevent this, we have to first understand the mechanism, that it's about insulin. There are factors that increase insulin, and there are factors that allow insulin to drop down. And those factors that increase are sugar. More sugar increases insulin. Higher frequency of meals increases insulin. That's so obvious. You eat something that drives blood sugar, then you're going to get insulin. The more often you do that, the more frequently you're going to put a burst of insulin into the system, the less time the system is going to have to recover. So the opposite of that, the factors that decrease insulin then, is to do the exact opposite. You reduce the sugar, you reduce the carbohydrates. That means low carb, high fat diets / keto. That means reducing the frequency of meals, intermittent fasting. And then you want to learn a little bit more about the factors that are contributing to blood sugar, such as stress. That if you're stressed all the time, you're going to make cortisol. Cortisol increases blood sugar, which will drive insulin and also drive insulin resistance. And then we have this last thing, and I recently did a video, you're welcome to check that out, about exercise, because exercise can work both ways. That you do want to increase your exercise. It is a good thing, but you want to increase the type of exercise that does not increase cortisol. Because if you exercise a lot that increases cortisol, you'll actually be driving insulin resistance while you're trying to reverse it. So you have to understand this, and then you have to measure the variable that matters, which is insulin. The insulin is going to change relatively soon compared to the glucose. You could measure insulin and find out in the very early stages where you are on the insulin resistance. We've got some videos on that as well on HOMA IR. And you could save yourself 10 years of not having to reverse something and backtrack. You can actually prevent it by measuring it and addressing it early. If you already have diabetes, if you're already diabetic, what do? You don't do anything different. You measure, you see where you are, you understand the mechanism, and you reverse the adaptation. You reverse that mechanism. And you may have to do more to reverse it. You probably have to do more to reverse it than someone who just needs to prevent it, because you have more momentum, you have more degeneration, it's been going on longer, you have less reserves, there's more habit in the body, and so on and so on. But it doesn't really change anything. The principles hold the same, and once you apply them, you can start measuring and see if it's working. If it is, great. If it's not, do more. Cut the carbs further, increase the time of fasting, and as long as you apply these principles, it will work. So unlike the medical model where they treat one thing and create the other, when you do this, you improve both, because you're addressing the root cause. You're not doing a cover-up. You're not trying to push the body from one place to the other. You're allowing it to do what it's supposed to do. If you enjoy this kind of information and you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so we can keep this information coming your way. And please, please, please share this with as many people as you can. Click those little links underneath and post it on Facebook and Twitter, etc., because this affects most people in the world. The majority of people in the world are affected by this or are heading that way. This is something we, as a world, we have to figure this out. We gotta get the right information out there. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.